begin. Um, we are on Daf Yud, Amud Aleph. I did want to mention that when we learned it, and think um, I think we might have mentioned this as we might have mentioned this when we learned it as well. Um, I think David had asked the question about there being a difference between the if the tree is covering the schach before the schach was put on, or if the tree uh, grew after the schach was already on, would there be a difference? And I think based on something that it was in the Steinsaltz's the Koran translation, there maybe mentioned something about this difference. So most of the Rishonim don't seem to consider there to be a difference, but there is one opinion, the Baal Hamar, who does make this difference, and he says an interesting thing. He says if you have the tree there before you put on the schach, so you slowly are putting on this kosher schach, and what ends up happening is at some point you have majority shade and sunlight. At that point, when you have majority shade, that majority shade is only because of the tree. So even if afterwards you continue putting a lot of kosher schach on top, it stays invalid because the tree is part of your original shade that is being given by the sukkah. However, if you first have the kosher schach completely, meaning you have majority shade and sunlight from kosher schach, and then you pull the vine over the sukkah, or it grows over the sukkah, or it flies back because it was being held up, it was tied down, and now it flies back over your sukkah. But your sukkah is already kosher from kosher schach, so then the tree is not going to invalidate your sukkah. Anyway, so that's the way the Baal Hamar wants to learn the Gemara. So that's probably what the Koran in that note that you were quoting, David, that's probably what he's referring to, is that opinion of the Baal Hamar. When we looked it up in the Shulchan Aruch had mentioned a line that doesn't matter whether the schach is there before the tree or the tree is there before the schach. And we mentioned that it's probably the Shulchan Aruch is mentioning that to exclude the view of the Baal Hamar, that we're not following that view. So anyway, there is such a view, and maybe that was what David was bringing up. Okay, anyway, we're on page Yud Amud Aleph on page 10a, and the Gemara here wants to know what's the difference between what's the size of this sukkah that will invalidate a sukkah that's under it, because we learned that sukkahs, that you only have one sukkah, you can't be dwelling in two sukkahs, you can't have a sukkah under a sukkah, you have to be dwelling in only one sukkah. And the Gemara wants to know how big is the top sukkah that will invalidate the bottom sukkah. Does it have the regular measurements of a kosher sukkah, or even not? Maybe it's still called a sukkah, even if it doesn't have the regular measurements of a kosher sukkah. So here we have a three-way machloikus. And so we're going to start on page 10a, and we are maybe 10 lines from the top of the page, maybe 9 lines from the top of the page, by the dot. There's a little dot in the Gemara. Kama yehei bein sukkah l'sukkah. So again, 10a, about 9 lines from the top of the page. Maybe 8 lines even. 1, 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4. No, 9 lines. Kama yehei bein sukkah l'sukkah. How much? Kama yehei. How much must there be bein sukkah l'sukkah, between sukkah and sukkah, between the top sukkah and the bottom sukkah? How much space must there be for the top sukkah to be considered a sukkah and will invalidate the sukkah below it? So the Gemara says, and the bottom one will become invalid. Amar Rav Huna says, not what you would think, that you need 10 hand breaths. Rav Huna says, tevach, one hand breath is good enough. That's called a sukkah already. That will invalidate the bottom. So you can't dwell in that sukkah. It's one hand breath. But it's a sukkah regarding invalidation purposes, to invalidate the sukkah under it. One tefach is good enough. And how does he know this? The Tanya, because we learned in a brisa. I'm sorry. Shekein motzinu. I skipped the line. Shekein motzinu bali tuma. That so we find with a tent of tuma. With a tent, ba'ale tuma. A tent of tuma. What is the size of a tent? The height of a oyel that makes anything in that tent tameh. That it really does two things. It impurifies anything that's under the tent, but it also does one other thing, and that is that it blocks the tumah from shooting upwards above the tent. So there's really two elements to this concept of oyel, of tent. And oyel is written in the Torah, by the way. It's adam ki yamos ba'oyel. If a person dies in a tent, or if there's a corpse in a tent, anything that's in
this week coming up, in fact.
Right. 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 That's Parshas Chukas, exactly. Yes. So so it says Adam ki yamas bayil siyata deshmaya. We're learning it now. That anyway, so it says that a person who dies in a tent, or kol ha'ba'al oyel v'chol asher ba'oyel yitmashev asyam, anyone that comes to the tent, or anything that's in the tent, the already is tameh for 7 days. Now, in the measurement of a tent is a tefach. Of the height of the tent is a tefach, is one handbreadth. The Tanan, because we learned in a Mishnah, tefach al tefach, berum tefach. A tent that's the length, the width, the length, the width, tefach al tefach, berum tefach, the height is a tefach. So the size of a tumah for a flesh of a corpse is a kazayas. As long as there's a size of an olive of the corpse, that would impurify all the vessels. So it says, Mevi yasatuma, it brings impurity to all the vessels that are under that tent. It also blocks the tuma, that it will not go upward above the tent. And any vessels that are above the tent, they do not become tameh, impure. The vessel that's above the tent is not going to be impure. It'll stay pure from before, because the tent blocks the tumah. There is a discussion here, and that is, and this was something that was bothering me. If you take a let's say you have a board, so that will be, there's a board here that's covering over some items. Oh, let's say a tent. You have a tent, an actual tent. A tent actually can't be slanted. So let's say it's flat on top. It's a flat roof tent. You have a tent, but it's very low. So we're saying here that you need to have a handbreadth of empty space. So let's say it's exactly a handbreadth of empty space. A tent, that's a handbreadth of empty space. What are you using it for? What's it made for? It's not for people, obviously, because you wouldn't be able to really fit in such a tent. But maybe it has some other purpose. I don't know. Anyway, the point, the issue that I want to bring up is how much empty space do you really need? Do you need there to be a handbreadth above the vessels and above the impurity? Or do you need there to be a tent that has a handbreadth of empty space? And in that handbreadth, you stick a corpse. There's a piece of a corpse inside that handbreadth. So where the corpse is, you don't have a tefach, a handbreadth of empty space. But in the other area of the tent, there is a handbreadth of empty space. Would that be sufficient? Or do you need there to be a full handbreadth of empty space above the corpse? You got what you got the question? So here, Rashi, if you look at Rashi over here on the wide lines, the second wide line says tefach al tefach berum tefach maybe as a tumah v'chaitzis b'nei tumah. If you have a handbreadth by a handbreadth by a handbreadth, length, width, and height. So you have that amount of space. It brings the impurity throughout the tent, and it's chaitzet, and it blocks the impurity from going above. And Rashi tells us this is halacha l'Moshe Sinai, this is a law given to Moses at Sinai, meaning in the Torah it doesn't say clearly that it has to be a handbreadth by a handbreadth by a handbreadth, but this is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, a law given to Moses at Sinai, a tradition said to Moses, dictated to Moses at Sinai. Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Aval pachos mitefach loy mevi v'loy chaitzitz. But if it's less than a tumah, it doesn't bring the tumah and it doesn't separate. It doesn't bring the tumah throughout the tent, and it doesn't separate from the tumah going upward and making impure any vessel that's sitting on top of this tent, or it's even more than on top of sitting on top of it. It's higher than that. But the tumah is not going to, if there's less than a handbreadth of empty space, the tumah will shoot upward and hit anything that's in its ear space. Now, loy mevi as a tumah, it will not bring the impurity to the entire tent. Tachas roishai, under the top of this tent. Echod, tachas roishai echod. I'm sorry. If the tumah, let me read that sentence. Im tumah tachas roishai echod. If the impurity is under one side, the kelim tachas roishai sheni, and the vessels are under another side. The hikoira, and it is a beam, arucha long, or a chava tefach, and its width is a tefach, a handbreadth at least. Urauya lahavi tuma, and it's fit to bring tuma, loy maisi, it will not bring it. Mishum deleka rum hefsik tefach mimena velakarka, because you don't have the height of a tefach between this beam and the ground. Very interesting. Rashi says that. He doesn't say you don't have a handbreadth between this beam and the corpse. He says you don't have a handbreadth of tumah between this beam and the ground. That means the corpse might be taking up space from this tefach. And where the corpse is, you do not have a handbreadth of space between the corpse and the ceiling. But the tent has a handbreadth of space. And because the tent surrounds this corpse with a handbreadth of space, so the corpse is inside the tent. And the tent will bring the tumah around. Now, and it will not separate. If you don't have a space of a tefach, it will not separate, it'll not block the tumah from going upward. And instead, the tumah will shoot upward and hit anything in its airspace. If there's any vessel on top of it, opposite the impurity, meaning where the impurity is in its airspace above it, afilu ad l'rakia, even to heavens, tame, it'll be tuma, the tuma retzutza, because tuma that shoots up, she'ein la oyel tefach, that doesn't have a tent of a tefach, by ka'as va'oila, it shoots up and goes upward. And so this is a interesting law that we're finding. Now, I must tell you that this is not the opinion of all the Rishonim. The other opinion is more obvious, I guess, more understood, more the more I guess famous opinion, which is that the tumah needs to have a tefach of space above it, and that's the opinion of the Ravid. Here, Rashi tells us this view that the corpse doesn't need to have a handbreadth of empty space. And 1 second. So so this Rashi tells us that in order to spread the tumah, in order to spread the tumah around to the other parts of the tent, the impurity does not need to have, the corpse doesn't need to have a full tefach above it. Now, the commentaries tell us that this opinion of Rashi only applies with regard to the tumah spreading under the tent. With regard to the tumah shooting upwards, with regard to that, the corpse needs to have a handbreadth above the corpse of empty space in order to stop the impurity from shooting upwards. But if the impurity the corpse doesn't have a full handbreadth of empty space above it to the top, to the roof, to the tent, then the tumah will shoot upward. So what we have here in Rashi is there's two rules, a little confusing. One is that in order to spread the tumah throughout the tent, you do not need an empty space of a tefach above the corpse. As long as you have empty space of a tefach from the ground to the tent, that would be good enough to spread the impurity throughout the tent. Now, however, with regard to stopping the tumah, the impurity from shooting upward, that you actually need a full handbreadth of empty space above the corpse to stop the tumah from shooting upward. So that is the meaning, according to Rashi, of this Mishnah. And again, according to the Ravid, you always need an empty space of a tefach, of a handbreadth, above the tumah, above the impurity, the corpse, in order to spread the tumah throughout the tent. In order to spread the tumah throughout the tent, the corpse needs to have an empty space above it of a full tefach. That's the Ravid's view. So now we have clarity on that question. This question was bothering me because I was wondering if it needed to have that. So it turns out it's a machlokes. It's an argument. And one of the opinions is Rashi here that says that tells us this I guess uh, unique law that the doesn't actually need a tefach. That's actually surprising. I think the Ravid's view is probably more the more accepted view. Okay, now the Gemara then continues with this mission over here, and it says, "Aval pachos mirum tefach." If it has less than a height of a tefach, loy mevi v'loy chaitzitz. It will not bring the impurity to other vessels that are. It will not bring the impurity to other vessels that are under the same tent. It will not stop the impurity from shooting upwards and making impure any vessels that are in the airspace of this corpse. Now, that is regarding the laws of Tumah. The Gemara here says the same law will apply to a sukkah. That as long as the sukkah is a handbreadth of empty space from top to bottom, that would be called a sukkah to invalidate the sukkah that's under it. However, if you have less than the measurement of a handbreadth, which we've explained to be somewhere between 3 and 4 inches, so if you have less than that space, then it's considered like one roof, one schach, and the bottom sukkah will be kosher. Now, what about the width and the length? That's an interesting question. The Gemara doesn't deal with that. The Gemara talks about the height, that the sukkah above, the upper sukkah, needs to be at least a tefach, but it doesn't mention anything about the width and the length in the Gemara. So the commentaries, of course, try to deal with this. What would be what's the halacha regarding the width and the length? Regarding this upper sukkah. But in any event, let's do the next opinion. Rav Chizda Rav Bar Rav Huna Amri Arba. Rav Chizda and Rav Bar Rav Huna say that you need 4 handbreadths. So again, we're finding a view that you don't need 10 handbreadths, which I would have thought that you need 10 handbreadths, and I think that's what logic would have said. But we have the view of Rav Chizda and Rav Bar Rav Huna that 4 handbreadths is considered a sukkah to invalidate a sukkah that's under it. If there's less than that, then it will not invalidate the bottom sukkah. And why is this so? Shaloi matzino makom, because we do not find makom chashuv to be something significant. Hachos may arba, less than 4 handbreadths, which is generally the size of like a reshus yachid, a private domain regarding Shabbos, that it needs to have 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths, and if not, it will not be considered a domain. And the same thing would be like a Carmelis, another type of domain regarding Shabbos. It needs to have a place that's called 4 by 4. That's called a reshus, a domain. And the same thing, interestingly enough, the Gemara is saying, so that's width and length. And our Gemara is saying that the height should be 4 handbreadths. Now, how can you compare the height to the width and the length of a domain? Okay, width and length need to have width and length need to make a domain 4 handbreadths. But what is that? How does that teach us something regarding the height? So here Taisha says that we find by a window going into between 2 chatzeros, 2 courtyards, that if the window has a height of 4 handbreadths, that would be considered good enough to make it one chotzer, to make both chatzeros, these courtyards, into one, and they could make one eruv chatzeros between them, and it could be considered a doorway. A window could be considered a doorway if it has 4 handbreadths. So that is we see this concept even regarding height. That height could be considered a domain, and less than 4 handbreadths is not considered a doorway. It would not allow it to be considered to be part of the same chutzner, the same courtyard. So basically, the sukkah that's above does not need to be the full 10 handbreadths. Even if it's 4 handbreadths, we will still call it a sukkah. That the law of sukkah tachas a sukkah will be invalidated. Now, what did these rabbis do with the other opinion? What about an oyel with regard to tumah? Regarding tumah, we find it works. A tent is 1 tevach. So why do these opinions hold you need 4? We do find that the Mishnah in oyelais talks about 1 handbreadth being good enough. 1 handbreadth is good enough. So it would seem that that they maybe should agree with the previous view of Rav Huna. So the commentaries explain that the previous view understood the law of Tumah to be a regular law of the Torah, and therefore it should apply to Sukkah. These rabbis hold that was considered a Gzeras HaKosov, a special law regarding Tumah. And that law would not apply to a Sukkah. A Sukkah would need to be a proper tent, meaning that law doesn't logically make any sense that you would call a tent something that is a handbreadth. That is not even considered a tent that's temporary, because how could anyone do anything in a tent that's less than a handbreadth? And because of that, these rabbis want to understand the law of Tumah to be what you call a Gzeras HaKosov, a law that is exceptional, unique, and limited to where it says it. It's a Gzeras HaKosov. There you have a special law that says it in that place, and you can't really learn from it to other places, because it really doesn't make sense to be considered an oyel. It's a special law. The Torah says, okay, we'll call it a tent. You want me to call this a tent? We'll call it a tent. It's called a Torah tent, because practically speaking, we would not be calling this a tent. We would not even be calling it a temporary tent, even though a tent itself is temporary. And then to call something a temporary tent would be really temporary. This is not even that. This is even less than a temporary tent. And yet the Torah says that's called a tent. Okay, so Gzeras HaKosov, the Torah gives us a rule that that's called a tent. But that tent law with regard to Tumah, we can't adapt it, or I should say, we can't apply it to the law of Sukkah, because it's special regarding the laws of Tumah. Now, Rav Huna, on the other hand, who does say we can apply it to the laws of Sukkah, he understood it that it's not a Gzeras HaKosov. It's maybe a tent for items. It's good for protection. Maybe he understands it that it's good for certain items. Don't need to have a height. If regarding a person, yeah, but regarding maybe regarding certain things, maybe it could be considered a tent. For whatever reason, he says you could learn it, that the Torah calls this a tent, and that would apply to Sukkah. But the rabbis, Rav Chizda, Rav Huna, they hold that you need to have at least 4 tfachim, 4 handbreadths, to be considered a makom chashuv, to be considered a significant place, and that would be considered a sukkah under a sukkah. And basically what we understand from this is that when it says you can't dwell in a sukkah under a sukkah, it doesn't mean that it has a law of a halachic sukkah. with all the rules of the halachic sukkah. This is called a sukkah, a hut under a hut. That's what it's saying. It's called a hut under a hut. It's a sukkah under a hut is a problem. It doesn't have all the laws of a sukkah. It doesn't have to have all the laws of a sukkah. It has to be considered a sukkah, even though our halachic sukkah has more rules, but that law is the law of a sukkah under what's not a halachic sukkah, a sukkah, a simple meaning, a meaning of sukkah. And according to the meaning of sukkah, that could be a place that is a makom chashuv. It has a significance, and that would be the height of 4 handbreadths. That would be considered significant. And now comes Shmuel, and Shmuel, I think, is the most obvious and understandable. And Shmuel says, Asara, that it has to have 10 handbreadths. And the reason is, my timer, what is the reason? The Shmuel of Shmuel. The same thing that would make a sukkah kosher, that's what makes a sukkah puzzle invalid. That the side of it's a kosher sukkah, that will make the sukkah invalid under it. So the sukkah that's under a sukkah needs to, according to Shmuel, needs to have minimally 10 handbreadths of space. Okay. The Gemara says, now, what would happen if it doesn't have 10 handbreadths? If it doesn't have 10 handbreadths, then it's not called a sukkah under a sukkah. If a sukkah needs to have 10 handbreadths to be kosher, then you would need the sukkah under it, the sukkah to have 10 handbreadths in order to invalidate the sukkah under it. Okay. Now, Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah. Again, our Mishnah was on page 9b, and we had 2 opinions. And the thing is, we need to understand Rabbi Yehuda, to understand what the rabbis say that argue on. Sometimes we don't have such clarity in one view unless we see the other view that argues. When you see the view that argues, then you have clarity on what the other view is really saying. So here we have in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda says, if you don't have people living in the top sukkah, the bottom sukkah could be kosher. The bottom sukkah is kosher. And that's Rabbi Yehuda's view. And he argued on the rabbis. Now, my aim diurin, what does he mean that there's no one living in the top sukkah? Ilema diurin mamish, want to say that it means that it really has no one that are living in that top sukkah. Otu diurim kogarmi? Is it the people who live there that cause the bottom sukkah to be invalid? I thought a sukkah under a sukkah is invalid. The top sukkah, does it say people have to live there? Doesn't say. Why would you need people to be living there? Do people living there cause the invalidation of the bottom sukkah? It doesn't say that they have to have people living there. It says a sukkah that's under a sukkah. So, elalav, rather, what must it be? My ain diurin. What does it mean? There's no one dwelling in the top sukkah. That would make then the bottom sukkah will be kosher, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Means kol she'ena ru'uya ladira. Anything that's not fit for dwelling, then the bottom sukkah will be kosher. The only reason a sukkah under a sukkah is invalid, the only case where a sukkah under a sukkah is invalid, is if the top sukkah is livable. But if it's not livable, then the bottom sukkah you will not say is a sukkah under a sukkah, because the top one is ein diurin ba'al yoina. It's unlivable. It's not possible to live there. Doesn't have potential. It's not fit for dwellers. In the top one, then you would not call the bottom one a sukkah under a sukkah because the top one is not really a authentic sukkah. It's not livable. So it's not the people that will cause it to be invalid. It's the fact that it's considered a sukkah, a proper sukkah, a livable sukkah, an authentic sukkah. So here he says, Vehechi dami, what would be a case? So the Gemara wants to say, maybe we can clarify the halacha of these three opinions, who the halacha follows from the Mishnah. Maybe we can prove one of the opinions from the Mishnah that we see that you need to have a sukkah that is livable. So, what would that case be? Deloy gavaya asara. If it's less than 10 tfachim, so since it's not considered a proper dwelling, it's a distasteful dwelling. So Rabbi Yehuda would say that's not called a sukkah that is livable, and the bottom one will be kosher according to Rabbi Yehuda. If you don't have 10 handbreadths, the bottom one will be kosher. Now that's michlal. That would imply the Tanakama Savar, the first opinion, which is the rabbis, they hold afal pi she'ena ru'uya ladira pasula. Even if it's not fit for dwelling, meaning it doesn't have 10 handbreadths. If it doesn't have 10 handbreadths, the bottom sukkah will still be invalid. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you need 10 handbreadths in order to make the bottom, to invalidate the bottom sukkah. But that's the other opinion. But the rabbis hold that we don't care about the urim b'olyoin if it's livable. Even if it's not livable, it will invalidate the bottom sukkah. So what comes out from here is it sounds like the Mishnah fits with two of the opinions, and we're proving Shmuel wrong. Because Shmuel said you need to have 10 handbreadths in order to invalidate the sukkah below. Our Gemara just proved from our Mishnah that would fit with Rabbi Yehuda's view, but it doesn't fit with the rabbi's view. And therefore, the rabbis must hold of a smaller opinion, a smaller amount to be considered a sukkah that will invalidate the sukkah below. According to Rabbi Yehuda, yeah, and 10 handbreadths, because if you can't dwell in it, then it will not invalidate the sukkah below it. So if it's less than 10 handbreadths, it won't invalidate. If it's more than 10 handbreadths, it will invalidate the sukkah below it. But the rabbis argue on Rabbi Yehuda. So now we have some clarity on what the rabbis are saying. That the rabbis just said a sukkah under a sukkah, but they didn't say how big the top sukkah has to be. And now we see, since Rabbi Yehuda says that in order to invalidate the bottom sukkah, the top sukkah has to have at least 10 handbreadths. That means the rabbis argued on that, and they said in all cases it's invalid, meaning even if it's less than 10 handbreadths. That would argue on Shmuel, and it would fit with Rav Chizda, Rav Huna himself. It would seem to fit with those views, but it definitely proves wrong Shmuel. So the Gemara says, Ki asa Rav Dimi. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Babylon, Amar, he said, Amri b'ma'arava, we say in the West, in Eretz Yisrael, that what is the meaning of Rabbi Yehuda's words, which we, in our Gemara, in our Gemara, a few lines up, we just explained that Rabbi Yehuda probably means that it's not fit for dwelling, and that would mean 10, less than 10 handbreadths. That's the way we explain it. What does it say in Ma'arava? In the West, in Eretz Yisrael, how do they explain it? That if it's not fit for dwelling, meaning if im hatachtoina yochaylo lakabel karem ksasais shelo, that if the bottom one, I'm sorry, im ein hatachtoina, if the bottom schach, the bottom roof, is not strong enough to handle the karim uksasais shelo yoina, the pillows and the cushions and the mattresses of the top one, if it can't handle it, it's not strong enough, hatachtoina kashera then the bottom one will be kosher because the top one has to be an authentic sukkah that's usable, meaning a usable sukkah. And if it's not usable, so now, according to this, we don't know about the measurement of 10 handbreadths. All we know is that it has to be usable, meaning that it has to be strong to be able to handle these type of cushions and mattresses. But does it have to be 10 handbreadths? Even the rabbis might hold, like Shmuel. Even in other words, Shmuel's opinion could fit very well that it has to be 10 handbreadths. Does it have to be strong, like Rabbi Yehuda says, that it has to be able to handle? That we'll soon see what exactly they're arguing about. But the size, even the first opinion, meaning the rabbis, they would hold that if it's less than 10 handbreadths, it will not invalidate the bottom sukkah. So the Gemara continues and says, Mechlal, the Tanakama Savar, this implies that the Tanakama would hold that the Gemara is asking it as a question. Does this imply that the Tanakama Savar Afal Pi She'ena Ru'uya, even if it's not fit, Lekabel, to handle the mattresses and the cushions and the pillows, Sula, it's going to be puzzle? So in other words, maybe what this means is that the rabbis don't care about it being livable. And according to that, could still ask a question on Shmuel. And it doesn't have to be able to handle the weight of, it's still going to invalidate the sukkah under it. And the same thing would apply if it's not livable. Meaning that it's not livable because of the weight. It's not livable because of the height. The height is too small. It can't handle the weight. Maybe the same thing would apply. So this would seemingly mean that the rabbis don't care about livability. That's a word. They don't care about that. They care about the fact that it's a sukkah. So meaning that it doesn't have to have 10 handbreadths. And that would be a kasha now, again, on Shmuel. So the Gemara answers that no. Ika beinayu, the difference between them is the achoylo lekabel al yedei hadcha. Is it able to handle these cushions and these pillows and maybe mattresses? If it could handle it, bakushi, like in a not a strong. It's not really overly strong, but it'll handle it for a little. In the meantime, it's doable. It's doable in a case of need. Al yedei hadchak. That's the common translation of shas hadchak, in a time of need, time of in a pressing moment. Al yedei hadchak means pressure, under pressure. So it could hand under in a pressing moment. You could handle. In other words, would I invite my friends over to to dance? No, in this sukkah. No, I wouldn't invite them to dance in this top sukkah. Would it handle the? Yeah, it'll handle the cushions. Would I leave them there for the whole year? No, but for 7 days, it's
Well,
under pressure. Work.
It sounds like the guys this type of difficulty, maybe like he's like hiding from robbers or something. He would go in there and whatever, but he's not going to hang out as if it's a safe sukkah.
Right. It's safe for a little while, but don't hang out too long. Any moment, at any given moment, it might fall through. But it's a time of pressure. You could go there. So in other words, it's not going to fall down when you stick your cushions and you stick your mattress on it. It's not going to fall down. How long? We don't know. But daichek, you could live there. Now, such a case, according to the rabbis, would be considered a sukkah, and it'll invalidate the sukkah that's below it. And Rabbi Yehuda would say, no, nope, this is not going to be an invalidating sukkah for the sukkah below it. It's not called a sukkah. It's not usable in a normal manner. It's only al yedei hadchak, so then it's not going to work. So according to that, we could say that Shmuel's opinion fits with the rabbis. The rabbis say it al yedei hadchak in a time of a pressing need. This is doable. It's not going to fall through. So in such a case, the same thing would be that it's usable if it has 10 handbreadths. 10 handbreadths is not an ideal size sukkah. It's not comfortable, but it's doable. Anything that's at least the height of 10 handbreadths is basically doable, and that would mean that the rabbis would hold, according to Shmuel, and Shmuel's opinion can fit with the rabbis, that the sukkah needs to be at least 10 handbreadths, and it needs to be able to be usable al yedei adchak in a time of need. That will make the sukkah below it to be invalid. It'll invalidate the sukkah that is below it. Okay, so that's basically this Gemara, and what comes out is that we have three opinions as to how big the sukkah above it has to be, at least in height. You don't have any clarity on the width and the length, and of course the simple understanding, at least in Shmuel for sure, would be 7 by 7. But although there is discussion, and we did touch upon this, that is the size 7 by 7, is that biblical, or is it really 6 by 6 that's biblical, and the extra handbreadth would be rabbinic? And if that's true, that means that biblically, even if it's 6 by 6, that could invalidate the sukkah below it, because by biblically, this is called a sukkah, even if it's only a width and a length of 6 tfachim. And if it's the width and length of 6 tfachim, if that's considered a kosher sukkah biblically, and the only extra tefach is only rabbinic law, then the sukkah that's below it will be invalid, even if the top sukkah is 6 by 6. However, if you want to say that even the law 7 by 7 is biblical, then that would mean that the sukkah below it will not be invalidated by a 6 by 6 sukkah above it. At least according to Shmuel, who holds that you need to have the sheer hechsher sukkah, you need to have the measurement of a kosher sukkah. Now, we don't have clarity, and the commentaries do talk about the other opinions, that maybe you could get away with a smaller sukkah according to them, meaning according to Rav Huna and according to Rav Chizda and Rabba bar Rav Huna, it might invalidate the sukkah below it, even if it's smaller, maybe 4 handbreadths by 4 handbreadths might be the size, but it could invalidate the sukkah even smaller, as we see that the height has a different height. So the sukkah below it would be would also possibly have a different measurement. The width and the length might also have a different measurement than a kosher sukkah. Anyway, so that's a topic of discussion. Okay, the next Mishnah is all about putting a sheet above the it's about putting other stuff on top of your sukkah, or on top of your schach, or under your schach, or having some type of canopy inside your sukkah. Okay, so the Mishnah, again, we're on page 10a. We're 7 lines from the bottom of the page, the new Mishnah. Pires aleha sadin. If you spread out on top of your sukkah, mipnei hachama, because of the sun. So you don't want the sun to come into the sukkah at all. You don't want any sunlight at all, meaning you have already more shade than sunlight, but you want that it should be even more than that. So you're adding shade to what you already have, majority shade, and you're using this sheet to give you more shade. So you spread out the sheet because of the sun. Or you spread it under the schach, mipnei hanishar, because of the leaves that fall from the schach onto your table when you're eating. And of course, you don't want that to happen. It's not enjoyable to have schach inside your soup or inside your food. So, or just falling on your head and little disruptive and frustrating. So you put this type of a sheet. You put a sheet under the schach. So the law is that it is hustle. Now, what is a sheet? A sheet is something that's makabel tuma. It receives tuma. It's considered a garment. It's called a kli, a vessel. And we know from the psukim that anything that can receive impurity, makabel tuma, is invalid for schach. Now, what is interesting is that there, if you put the decorations under the schach within 4 handbreadths, we're going to learn that that doesn't invalidate the schach. So here you put this sheet under the schach. It's definitely within 4 handbreadths of the schach. It's right there. So why is it going to invalidate the schach that has a significant amount of schach, sufficient amount of schach on its own, kosher schach, and now you put this thing there that's blocking it. But we know that if you put something for decoration purposes, that is considered kosher. So why would this sheet invalidate your sukkah? So the commentaries explain that when you put something that when something is placed there for decoration, it becomes batel. It's for the sukkah. It's batel to the mitzvah of sukkah. It's used for the decorative purposes of the sukkah. If you're putting a sheet there to attach the leaves, it's for yourself. So when it's meant for the sukkah, it becomes batel to the schach. In other words, it's meant to beautify the sukkah. It becomes batel to the mitzvah, nullified, and it's as if it's not there. But if it's used for your enjoyment, then it's not nullified to the sukkah, and then it could actually invalidate. Okay, anyway, then there might be other explanations, which we'll get into. But in the meantime, so we have this sheet that you put either above the schach or below the schach, oy shapires al gabe hakinoy, or you spread out the sheet on top of these 4 poles that cover some type of canopy over your bed. And this is for beauty. And Pesula, all of these cases, it's going to be invalid, which means that you do not fulfill the mitzvah of sleeping in the sukkah when you sleep in such a sukkah. Now, the Mishnah continues and says, if you have a bed that only has 2 poles, so you've spread out the sheet above that, the thing is that the top of this tent that you're spreading the sheet on the top, it comes to a point that's not a handbreadth flat. It goes to a point that's less than 3 or 4 inches, and because of that, it's not called a tent. So if you're allowed to you're allowed to put it on top of these, on top of the two poles of your bed, the one at the head, one at the feet of your bed. You would be allowed to put a sheet there, and that would not be a problem because that's not a tent, and you would actually be dwelling in a sukkah. The Gemara says, Amar Rav Chizda says, Loishano ela b'nei hanashar. We only learn this din about spreading the sheet under the schach only where you spread because of the you spread this sheet under the schach because of the falling leaves, and your aval lina'isa. But if you spread it in order to beautify the sukkah, keshera, it would be kosher. That if you spread this sheet because of beautifying the sukkah, and it's recognizable that it's beautifying the sukkah, then it would not be a problem, and it would be kosher. And of course, the Gemara asks, Pshita, that's obvious. Mibnei hanashar tanan. We said in the Mishnah that you're spreading it because of the nashar, because of the falling leaves, and the understanding from those words is that that would be the reason why it would be invalid. If it would be for the sake of the sukkah, then it wouldn't be invalid. And we'll soon see the answer. We're going to stop here.
Rabbi,